Well, welcome everybody to Conscious Cafe Global, our Zoom call tonight. And I say tonight, wherever you are in the world. And my name's Gina Lazenby, and I'm hosting this evening, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Taylor. Our program tonight is talking about transformation through turmoil, and I would imagine there are very few people that haven't experienced at some point in their life some kind of turmoil, some kind of hiatus, and this is what Steve's going to be talking about tonight. He's actually a transpersonal psychologist who's had 15 years of experience in listening to people's stories about how through some kind of challenge in their life, a spiritual awakening has happened. He is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University. He's actually based in the north near me in Manchester. He's the author of at least a dozen best-selling books on psychology and spirituality that includes time expansion experiences. And in fact, Steve came and was a keynote speaker at the Science and Consciousness Summit, which happens near Steve at Broughton. I think we've got another one this autumn each year. It's a very interesting community of science and spirituality, which is a really fantastic movement. And he was a keynote speaker on time expansion. His latest book, Extraordinary Awakenings, The Fall, The Leap, Spiritual Science. And I'm sure we've all heard of Eckhart Tolle, and he has given a lovely endorsement to Steve, saying that his work is an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present, which it truly is. So welcome, Steve. Our welcome is to shake our hands in the air and say welcome.
Welcome.
I'm handing over to you, and I'm here to support you as you carry on. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Gina. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Judy as well. As Gina said, I'm going to speak about one of my main areas of research as a psychologist, which is transformation through turmoil. And obviously, it's part of my human experience too. I think all human beings have experienced some degree of turmoil in their lives. And probably most human beings have experienced some degree of positive development, or even transformation as a result of that turmoil, even spiritual awakening. I'm going to discuss some cases of spiritual awakening that were triggered by periods of intense turmoil. Spiritual awakening is one of those terms that it's quite difficult to define. It kind of means something different to almost everybody. If you asked 100 spiritual teachers, what is spiritual awakening? They would probably give you 100 different answers. But for me, it's quite simple, really. I don't think of spiritual awakening as connected to any particular spiritual tradition or religious tradition. It can occur in the context of spiritual traditions or religions, but it's essentially something that, lies outside or beyond any particular spiritual tradition or religion. It's a human experience which, is filtered through different traditions and explained in different ways in different traditions. But essentially, it can happen to people who don't know anything about spirituality in a traditional context. People who are not religious, people who may even consider themselves atheists. Of course, after their spiritual awakening, they may have a different perspective. So we'll look into a couple of cases, 2 or 3 cases from my research later on, which illustrate that. But let me explain to you how I came to be interested in this area. It really emerged from my own experience. When I was 16, before then I'd been a pretty happy child. I had a pretty kind of normal, fairly harmonious childhood. I was quite fortunate in that my parents, were good people, and they had a stable relationships. I was brought up in this sort of background of affection and stability. But when I was about 16, something seemed to change inside me. I don't know why, but I became a different person. I became very unhappy, very alienated, very depressed. I thought a lot about taking my own life. I was so depressed a lot of the time. But occasionally I would have these moments when all of my troubles seemed to fade away, and I'd feel connected to everything around me. I'd walk through the park or through my school fields, and all of the nature around me would seem to be alive and beautiful and harmonious. All of the phenomena around me seemed to be interconnected, as if they were expressions of something deeper than themselves. almost as if there was some sort of fundamental energy that I was aware of, and everything was a manifestation of some fundamental energy. And I felt connected to everything too. I felt lifted above my worries. Everything seemed to be fine. I felt as though I had nothing to worry about for the time being. And then I'd fall back into depression again, and it took me a long time to understand that these experiences of euphoria were actually spiritual experiences. My background wasn't religious at all. My parents weren't religious. They weren't interested in spirituality at all. So for a long time, I thought it was a bit crazy. I thought, what's wrong with me? Why am I having these strange experiences? I already thought I was quite crazy because I felt alienated. But these experiences made me think, wow, I must be completely crazy. And luckily, I didn't tell my parents about these experiences. They would have been even more worried about me and maybe sent me to see a psychiatrist. But when I was in my early 20s, I discovered a book. It was actually called Mysticism, a study and an anthology by a man called F.C. Happold, a scholar of mysticism. And this book, it was like a revelation to me. It made complete sense to me. And it made me realize that I had been having mystical type experiences. There wasn't something, I wasn't crazy. Or if I was crazy, there were lots of other people who were crazy just like me. I wasn't alone in my craziness. So once I'd read that book, I started to read other spiritual texts, other mystical books. I began to be interested in spirituality, went to a lot of talks, I learned to meditate. So suddenly I had this framework to make sense of myself. This whole new world of spirituality opened up to me, and it was a revelation. It gave me a sense of self-understanding and a sense of self-acceptance. So it put me on the right. Finally, I felt like I was on the right track in my life, and I was heading in the right direction. Years later, I became a psychologist. Back then, it's too long to go into, but I was a musician back then. I was used to play in bands and spent a few years traveling around playing music. But once I'd realized that my musical career wasn't really going in any particular direction, and once I'd sort of grown fed up with the typical hedonistic life, the unstable life of a musician, I decided to go back to university to study psychology. And I specialized in the area of transpersonal psychology, which, as I'm sure some of you know, is basically spiritual psychology. It's the study of spirituality from a psychological point of view. And once I found out about transpersonal psychology, I thought, wow, this is where I'm meant to be. This is exactly where I fit in. This gives me a place and a role. So I did a master's degree and a PhD and got a position at a university in Leeds, where I still am now. I've been there for about 17 or 18 years now. Once I was a psychologist, I decided to study my own experiences, what I called awakening experiences, the spiritual experiences had as a young man. I wanted to study these experiences in order to find out how common they were. I especially wanted to find out what were the triggers of these experiences. Were they completely random? Or did they occur for particular reasons? Were they related to particular activities, particular states of mind? So I began to do research on what I called awakening experiences. And I'll share with you now the question I always used in my research. This is the question I asked in my research, and you can reply yes or no in the chat box. Have you ever had an awakening experience in which your awareness of reality has intensified and expanded? This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become more beautiful and real, and you've felt a deep sense of well-being. Perhaps you have felt a sense of harmony and meaning pervade the world, a sense that all things are one and that you are part of this oneness. The experience may have left you with a sense that life is more meaningful. So yeah, feel free to reply in the chat box. Yeah, you may have had these experiences more than once.
You've got a lot of yeses, Steve.
Oh, great. Yeah, I can't actually see the chat box.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I can actually. Yeah.
Yeah, one or two saying no, but
No.
a lot of yeses.
Hmm. My cat, he says yes to. In fact, he lives in a continual state of spiritual awakening. Wasn't there there's a quote from Eckhart Tolle. Somebody said, "Have you ever met an enlightened being?" And he said, "Yeah, I've met lots of enlightened beings, all of them cats." So yeah, I think many of you have had this type of experience. And in fact, in my research, I have found that it is quite a common human experience. Something like around 45% of people have had this experience at least once, and many people have had it more than once. And some people even live in a continual or ongoing state of wakefulness. We'll look at that in a moment. Let me just share a couple of typical examples from my research. The first one here is a fairly, I guess you could say it's a low intensity awakening experience. Awakening experiences happen at different intensities. This is probably a low level intensity one. This is a woman who was swimming in a lake, and she said, I swam out as far as I could to the middle of the lake, and I just looked around treading water. I felt completely alone, but part of everything. All my troubles disappeared, and I felt in harmony with nature. It only lasted a few minutes, but I remember the sense of calmness and stillness. I think many of us have had that type of experience when we're in natural surroundings, swimming in a lake or walking in the countryside. Many poets talk about these kind of experiences, like Wordsworth writes about these experiences. There are many spiritual poets who feel the sense of connection to nature. The second type of experience is what I would call, excuse me, a high intensity awakening experience. These type of experiences are more rare. Obviously, the more intense awakening experiences become, the more rare they are. So this is a high intensity awakening experience, which happened to a child. The man who described it, he said he was just 6 or 7 years old when it happened. He was in Scotland. I think he was in Glasgow. And he was running out. He lived on a street of terrace houses in Glasgow. And one day he was running out of the front door of his house. And as soon as he went outside, everything shifted. This is how he described it. Everything was pulsating with life and energy. The houses, the road, everything. I was made up of the same pulsating energy. I lay down, looked up to the sky, and just felt the oneness of everything. Felt the earth spinning in its orbit. I melted into the ground. I seemed to understand and know that everything is freshly created every moment. There was a rather sad aftermath to this experience because he made the mistake, which I didn't make. He told his parents about the experience, and he had a few similar experiences, and his parents didn't know what to make of them. They thought there's something wrong with him. They sent him to see the doctor. The doctor sent him to see a psychiatrist. He was actually prescribed medication because of these experiences, which is quite tragic, but not uncommon, unfortunately. You I've always thought that some of the people who are diagnosed, perhaps many of the people who are diagnosed with psychosis, are actually having spiritual awakenings. Maybe finding them quite difficult to process. Maybe the spiritual awakenings do sometimes cause disturbance, and they can be quite challenging. But yeah, but definitely a lot of spiritual awakenings are misdiagnosed as psychosis, and this was an example. But fortunately, the man later on in his life, he found out about spirituality, and he realized that these experiences were not pathological. They're actually transcendent, powerful, and positive. Some of the highest, deepest, and greatest experiences we can have as human beings. Now, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for maybe 5 minutes or something like that.
Welcome back, everyone. There you go, Steve. People are back.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Hope you had a fruitful discussion about your awakening experiences and about, the triggers of awakening experiences. Well, yeah, I would be interested to know what you thought. Maybe it might be easier to do it in the chat box initially. What maybe one person from each group could summarize what do you think are the most prevalent or would be the most prevalent triggers of these experiences for people in general?
People, I don't know whether you click the chat button and can see nature. So two
Yeah, I can
people
see
said
nature.
nature as a trigger.
Mm. The surrender of the self, needing or striving. Yeah, that mode of surrender, no longer doing or striving, being in nature.
Yeah, psychedelics. That's a trigger.
Psychedelics, yeah.
That's a choice, isn't it? You would take a psychedelic rather than be given it and not know.
Yeah.
You would engineer that
Well,
experience.
hopefully you have a choice about it, unless somebody slipped it into your tea, like they used to do in the 1960s.
Breathwork's an interesting one. Rebirthing, yeah, powerful.
Yeah. Sarah says, for me personally, my most profound experience happened after a period of intense anxiety and grief. But being in nature definitely helps.
I suppose there could be more than one cause, thinking coalescing,
Yeah, that's right.
thinking through an
Violet says, a shock. I was made redundant. And that moved me into an awakening experience. Meditation, Jane says. Dreams, yeah, dreams, of course. Childbirth, that's an interesting one. Tamara said childbirth. That's really interesting. I've heard a lot of reports of powerful awakening experiences during childbirth. Also, in the aftermath, during the period of stress and sleeplessness after a child is born, I've heard reports of even, transformation through turmoil happening in that context. Yoga. So yeah, these are all very common triggers. But I'll share with you the results of my research. I've done 3 research projects on awakening experiences, and working with other researchers, we've analyzed reports to find out the most common triggers of these experiences. And I'll just show you the results from one of our studies. I'll just briefly share a slide with you again. This was a study of around 90 awakening experiences. And we found that of 91 awakening experiences, the most common triggers were psychological turmoil was the most common trigger. So a couple of people mentioned anxiety or being made redundant. So 37 of the 91 awakening experiences were related to stress, depression, loss, bereavement. After that, the most common trigger was contact with nature, 23 experiences. Some experiences had more than one trigger or more than one context. Spiritual practice and spiritual literature were also common triggers. But it's interesting, this finding has occurred in all of my research on awakening experiences that the most common trigger is psychological turmoil, which doesn't seem to make sense because psychological turmoil is obviously deeply distressing. It's a very negative experience. So it doesn't make sense that we should suddenly shift from this very distressing experience into a polar opposite experience of joy and bliss and freedom and oneness. But it seems to suggest that bliss and despair are not opposites. In some way, they are closely interrelated. By the way, it's interesting in this study, psychedelics did not come up as a common trigger. I think there were only 2 experiences related to psychedelics. That's probably because this was a study with the general population, and amongst the general population, not so many people have taken psychedelics, or at least taken psychedelics, frequently or regularly. So that's probably why it doesn't come up as a significant finding. Although obviously there is a strong relationship between psychedelics and awakening experiences. Let me just share with you a typical example of an awakening experience that was induced by intense Turmoil. This was a young woman who was suffering from severe depression. She was actually hospitalized following a suicide attempt. And she was lying in hospital one morning, and for some reason, when she woke up, there was a marble on her bedside table, which is why there was a marble in the slide here. She picked up this marble, and this is how she suddenly shifted into a different state of consciousness, which she described as, I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. She saw the marble as a symbol of perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems, my suffering, suddenly seemed meaningless, ridiculous, simply a misunderstanding of my true nature and everything around me. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. It was a moment of enlightenment. The euphoria and inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days. A very powerful and beautiful experience. And one of the characteristics of awakening experiences is that even though they tend to be quite short, they may last just for a few seconds, maybe a few hours if you're really lucky, but they tend to be very short. But they always have an after effect, a long lasting, even a permanent after effect. And in this woman's case, the experience helped to lift her out of depression. It showed her that there was a positive aspect to reality. There was a meaning to life. There was this realm of harmony that she knew was there, even if she wasn't there anymore in a normal state of consciousness. She knew it was there, as a reality which she could gain access to. So she started to investigate, like a lot of people who have these experiences, she started to investigate spiritual practices and paths. And she did begin to emerge from her depression. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides for a moment. Oh, there's a couple of comments. Maybe the difficulties of stress and depression rock the boat as far as safety and stability is concerned. I think so. I believe it is a result of the recognition that no control is possible. Therefore, there is no choice but surrender. Good points. We'll come back to those in a short while. One of the interesting things, though, in my research was that some of the people who reported these awakening experiences in situations of intense turmoil, they also said that it wasn't a temporary experience. Something inside me shifted in that experience, and I became a completely different person. They said that I've never been the same person since that experience. I realized that people were actually talking about, some people were actually talking about a permanent transformation, which was equivalent to a spiritual awakening. In other words, some people in the midst of intense turmoil, it was as if their normal consciousness or their normal identity broke down and a new identity took over. They felt that they became different people, almost as if a new self had risen like a phoenix inside them from the ashes of their old self. So that became another area of my research. I began to investigate experiences of intense turmoil which led to a permanent transformation. And that is what I called transformation through turmoil. And I began to find that it wasn't actually uncommon. I had an interesting experience about 10 years ago when I appeared on Woman's Hour on Radio 4 to talk about one of my books about these experiences. It was called Out of the Darkness. And in the aftermath, I only talked for about 5 minutes about the experiences. And one of my case studies was on the program as well, describing her experience. And afterwards, I was flooded with similar experiences from other members of the public who'd caught the radio show. Literally hundreds of them came through to my university email. And it's still, I still regularly receive reports of these experiences. People often say, I was going through a period of deep depression, or I went through a period of addiction. I was diagnosed with cancer. Any period of intense turmoil can have this transformational effect. And it was remarkable that the transformation didn't, the transformation held. People didn't revert to their previous state of being. They remained in this higher state of consciousness, this higher functioning state. So this is, as I say, this is what I call transformation through turmoil. Once I began to do research on it, I realized that there is a similar concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. Maybe some of you have heard of that concept, post-traumatic growth. It's a common finding in psychology that any type of trauma can have positive after effects, even if it takes years for them to manifest themselves. Eventually, once the initial stress of trauma has begun to fade a little bit, positive after effects begin to manifest themselves so that people feel a greater sense of appreciation. Their relationships become stronger and deeper. They become more philosophical about life. They develop an interest in spirituality. All of these are common after effects of trauma. What I call transformation through turmoil, you could say it's an extreme form of post-traumatic growth, because post-traumatic growth is normally gradual over years, but transformation through turmoil often occurs very suddenly and dramatically in a moment of transformation, which leaves a person in a different state for the rest of their lives. Let me just share a couple of examples from my research, and then we'll discuss our own experiences. Oh, by the way, this is a slide about post-traumatic growth. These are the characteristics from post-traumatic growth: personal strength, relating to others, appreciation for life, new possibilities, and spiritual change. And research has found that a very specific figure of 47% of people experience these positive after effects after any kind of trauma, no matter how intense it is. In fact, in some ways, the more intense trauma is, the more likely it is to have positive after effects, as long as a person processes and the trauma to some extent, and once the initial intensity of the stress has begun to fade away. But this is what I mean by transformation through turmoil. This is a book I wrote about these experiences called Extraordinary Awakenings. It doesn't really matter, as I say, it doesn't really matter what the type of trauma is. It can be serious illness, bereavement, depression, disability, addiction, loss. It doesn't really matter what the type of trauma is. All of these types of trauma can give rise to a dramatic transformation into a higher functioning state, which is equivalent to spiritual awakening. Even if a person doesn't know anything about spirituality, which a lot of the people don't who have these experiences, it is essentially the same as what different traditions refer to or describe as spiritual awakening. In one of the cases I investigated, the guy, I think he was actually, the next point here is that TTT is not uncommon amongst prisoners and soldiers, which is amazing. I wrote 2 chapters in this book about transformations through turmoil in prisoners, because there were so many cases of prisoners who went through transformation, and soldiers too. But in this case I wanted to tell you about, it's a prisoner. He underwent a transformation when he was in prison in Africa in very severe conditions. And when he came back, he was actually English, he was an English sailor who was imprisoned in Africa. Once he got back to England, he tried to understand and to process what had happened to him, because he didn't know anything about spirituality. He thought that he'd gone crazy. And he actually bought a textbook of psychiatric disorders to try to identify his condition. He went through, he looked up bipolar. He thought, no, it doesn't seem like I'm bipolar because I don't have these negative, depressive symptoms. Don't think I'm schizophrenic. Don't think I'm psychotic. So he thought, no, none of these disorders seem to fit to me. Then he found a book. I think it was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And he thought, yeah, this is my condition. This is this is me. This is what's happened to me. And he understood that he wasn't crazy. He had gone through a spiritual awakening. And after that, he was never the same person. And his friends didn't know what to make of him. He actually, unfortunately, separated from his wife because she couldn't understand his new state of being, and he couldn't really relate to her anymore. So I guess that's one of the slightly negative aspects of these experiences, is they can lead to divorce or a rupture in friendships. So yeah, this, like many people, this guy didn't know anything about spirituality until months after his experience. He stumbled on a spiritual book and suddenly had a framework to make sense of his experience. But here's one example from my research. This is a woman called Irene Murray who was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 42. And she was told that her cancer was aggressive and advanced and that maybe she only had 6 to 9 months left to live. She was a high functioning professional person, very successful in her job. She was a marketing person for a pharmaceutical company. But she underwent a big shift as soon as she was diagnosed with cancer. As soon as she was told that she had cancer, something changed in her immediately. As soon as she left the consulting room, she felt like she was a different person. And this is how she described it. She said, "It was the first time I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life is just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive. The fact that I'm still here. The air was so clean and fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green, and everything was so alive. I had a tremendous feeling of connectedness." This was straight after she was diagnosed with cancer. So again, it seems very paradoxical that she was told that she probably only had a few months left to live, but she shifted into this higher state of consciousness. And it de-intensified to some degree, which is often the case, but it remained as a normal state. When I spoke to her, it had been 13 years since this experience. So she'd remained in a higher functioning state for 13 years. So she described it as that feeling was really intense for the first few weeks and it's remained ever since. I used to just sit and think, this is amazing that things could just fall into place so quickly. As you probably guessed from my description, her cancer went into remission and she felt incredibly grateful that when I spoke to her, it had been 13 years since she'd been cancer free, but she remained, the high state of consciousness which the cancer diagnosis had induced had remained. And everything about her life changed. She gave up her job as a marketing executive and retrained as a cancer therapist, working at Christie's Hospital here in Manchester. And all the values shifted. And she felt like she had a new appreciation for everything. She felt a new sense of connection to nature, which is very common after these experiences. Let me just share another example. This is an example of transformation through turmoil in relation to addiction. This is a very extreme case, but again, not uncommon. I have a whole chapter in my book related to addiction. There are so many cases of people who've recovered from severe addiction and shifted into an awakened state. This is a Scottish woman called Eve, who was an alcoholic, and for a long time, she started drinking when she was very young, and by the time she was 42, I think the same age as Irene, coincidentally, she felt that she was completely broken down due to her alcoholism. She was homeless on the streets of Edinburgh. She tried to stop drinking, but couldn't. She'd just given up the idea of stopping because she couldn't. And she was kind of resigned to death, more or less. And in fact, she did attempt to take her own life. And her transformation occurred after her attempt to take her own life. Basically, she jumped in front of a bus that was traveling from Glasgow to Edinburgh, but the bus swerved, so she survived. And the police arrived and took her straight back to her parents' house. And she hadn't seen her parents for a long time. And her parents assumed, they knew she was an alcoholic, so they said, well, we may as well give you a glass of wine because you're an alcoholic. But she picked up the glass and couldn't drink it. This is how she described it. She said, I picked up the glass, lifted it, then put it down. I kept picking it up and putting it down. It wasn't me that was putting it down. And you can see this is a picture that Eve gave me straight after this experience. You can see that she's quite bruised and battered from her accident, but you can see that she is in a state of well-being. And a doctor came and gave her some medication to deal with withdrawal symptoms. But shortly afterwards, this is what she described. She said, I looked at myself in the mirror, and it was one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had. I had no idea who I was. I felt like a completely different person. It was as if she had undergone a sudden identity shift so that she didn't recognize herself anymore. And one of the effects of this identity shift was that the urge or the craving for alcohol just faded away in a very mysterious, miraculous way. She lost the desire to drink after 29 years. And again, I spoke to her 10 years, I think it was, after this experience. And the urge to drink alcohol had never returned. And everything about her had changed. She said, my whole psyche changed completely. I have no trauma in spite of all the terrible things I went through. It was like being catapulted from one world into the next. Now, you wouldn't recognize Eve at all if you saw her now. She's she's very active in AA, but she is a person with a strong sense of altruism and connection to nature and a strong sense of well-being. As I say, this is a very mysterious experience that craving can disappear very suddenly like this, but it's not uncommon. I developed the concept of addiction release to describe it because it's such a common, well, maybe it's not an uncommon experience amongst people in the severe stages of addiction. So at this point, I thought maybe we could go back to the breakout rooms for a few minutes. And it's probably very likely that any of you have had the kind of experiences that Irene or Eve have reported. These are very intense experiences, very, very remarkable experiences. But I wonder if you've ever experienced something similar, if not perhaps quite as intense. Or maybe you've experienced post-traumatic growth, which I discussed earlier, which is the more gradual and less intense form of this experience. You've probably heard this phrase from Nietzsche, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, which I guess describes this type of experience. Is that true? Maybe there are some exceptions where it's not the case. And finally, maybe one thing I'd like you to discuss is why does psychological turmoil have this effect? I think some of you have pointed to some answers in the chat box, but maybe you can just discuss those answers in some further detail.
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, Steve, do you want some people to give you some comments in the chat, and maybe one or two people are burning to?
Yeah, if anybody would like to, share their experience of transformation through turmoil, or just to suggest an idea about why psychological turmoil can be transformational, why it can have this transformational effect. So you can either do that in the chat box, or if you like, feel free to unmute yourself and share.
Yeah. Anybody want to put their hand up and I'll unmute you? Okay, Violet.
Yeah, with me, it was a silence. The shock kind of produced a silence that stopped the inner chatter that, normally is going on in the mind, the everyday chatter that we're so used to. And that silence, changed everything. And it stayed with me for about 3 months. It was just absolutely wonderful. It didn't matter what happened. Just being in that silence was like very special. I forgot what the question was again. I'm just busy talking about my experience here. And why do I think? I think it's because it causes silence. And so when there is the silence, then the other thing, the other awareness comes through. And in everyday life, we've got this chatter going on.
Oh, right. Yeah. So yeah, an inner silence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that remained for 3 months. Has anything kind of
It remained for 3 months, and then when it kind of, I noticed that the everyday chatter was kind of more than the silence. I spent about the next 2 years trying to get back to the silence before I realized, hey, that's not going to happen. You're going to have different experiences, but let that go.
Right. Thanks for sharing that.
Who else?
I feel it happened. I've always had the sense that it happened when it did, after this period of prolonged trauma, because at some point my mind just gave up on trying to reconcile it cognitively. Like, it had tried everything to try and understand it, kind of almost match it off like an accounting process, and no matter which way around it tried, it wasn't having any of it, and then it just gave up. And when it gave up, that everything cleared and it became clear, and the reconciliation that was being sought was just there.
Right. Beautiful. So it was related to accepting that you couldn't understand it and kind of letting go of the attempt to understand.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I could.
Yeah. Paradoxically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Sarah. Who else? Anybody else? I'm looking at the gallery. Anybody else putting their hand up or want to share what came out of that conversation? No, I think we've got... Nicola says in the chat, I think that near-death experiences can make people question their version of reality and think more deeply about being alive.
Yeah. Certainly in my research, I found that of all the different types of trauma, one of the most common elements of transformation was an encounter with death. Not necessarily a near-death experience in the traditional sense of leaving your body and traveling through darkness towards light, but simply coming close to death through cancer or an accident or addiction or a suicide, an attempt to take one's own life. It's kind of waking up to the reality of death and also waking up to the reality of life in the shadow of death. And once it was an awakening. Once you have seen that, then you don't go back to sleep again. Tamara has raised her hand.
Yep, Tamara, spotlight.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I was talking quite a bit about when there's actually no choice, when you have no choice, when maybe a bomb has exploded above you, or you've fallen out of a window, or you've faced a near-death experience, or you've been told you have a terminal illness, or you're in labor with a child and you can't get it back in. You can't turn off the process. Then there's that either you collapse totally, which is not a bad thing, or which may be the trauma that people do experience as bad. Everybody else around you will worry about you. I want to make you better and bring you back to the person they think you were. While meanwhile, I think we see that a lot in older people who are on their way, and it doesn't matter them who they once were. It no longer matters to become something, to be something. I think this is really crucial, and our society is so focused on being somebody, being successful, being bigger, be the first, be the strongest, be the cleverest, pass your exams, become somebody. This is my own experience, and I'm probably older than almost everybody here. So
there's a really strange phenomenon in psychology which people don't really understand. It's called, I don't know if anybody's heard about it. It's called the U-bend in happiness. When you track levels of well-being in human life, people start quite high. Adolescence is a time of high well-being, but well-being slowly sinks into middle age. It reaches its lowest point in middle age. I think the age of 47 is meant to be the age of lowest well-being. But then, paradoxically, it starts to increase, and
Yeah.
well-being peaks again over 65. So over 65 reaches
Oh,
the
yeah.
same peak as adolescence in terms of well-being. So it's
Yes.
a U-bend shape. Nobody really understands why, but I think it's a lot to do with that letting go, letting go of your ambitions and
Yes.
accepting your life, accepting yourself as you are.
And not really, not much bothering about what other people think about you. It liberating. So
Yeah,
not having to be something for somebody else.
yeah, giving up your unfeasible goals and accepting life as it is. Becoming more present. Yeah. But in relation to transformation through turmoil, yeah, I think you're all right. The way I explain it is, I mean, obviously there's no hard and fast explanation, but the way I explain it is in terms of ego dissolution. Once a person goes through intense turmoil, their ego can collapse under the pressure, like a house that collapses in a hurricane. Or maybe it can be a long, slow process of breaking psychological attachments as a person loses all of the things that constitute their identity. But so slowly the house can collapse, and at a certain point it just collapses altogether into a heap on the ground. So this is ego dissolution in relation to stress or turmoil, which is obviously a painful experience. And for some people, it remains just a painful experience. But for others, it allows a new self to be born inside them, a kind of latent, spiritually awakened self, which was previously obscured and couldn't express itself. But in relation to, I mean, everybody goes through trauma at some point in their lives, at multiple points, but not so many people go through this transformation. So I think one of the reasons why some people go through this transformation is because of an attitude of acceptance, an attitude of letting go. I talk about what I call the alchemy of acceptance. When you accept your predicament, even if it's a terrible predicament, once you accept it, then you release something releases inside you, and that's when you undergo transformation. In many of the people I interviewed, they could identify one particular moment when they underwent transformation, and it was usually that moment of acceptance, when they stopped resisting their predicament. When I remember speaking to an alcoholic who said he handed over his problem, and that was the moment when he experienced transformation. So yeah, it is all about letting go. Acceptance has an alchemical power to release the transformational potential of these experiences. If I may, I'll finish by reading a poem on that theme, and then we have a few minutes. We'll have a few minutes left for questions, hopefully. But I'll just illustrate what I've just said by reading a short poem of mine, which is from a book of mine called The Clear Light, book of poetry. And this is called The Alchemy of Acceptance. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, glowing with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a sharp, concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape, to push away the pain. Or pain can be a sensation that you move towards and merge with, that no longer has a center, that dissipates through your being, until it becomes soft, numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of your being, give rise to a greater structure, a miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating, full of obstacles, with desires for a different life constantly disturbing your mind. Or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Thank you. I guess what that illustrates is that, we're always going to face turmoil and trauma in our lives at some point, as we have already. So when those moments arrive, there is an opportunity to harness growth and even transformation. And partly that depends on our attitude to the turmoil and trauma, whether we face it and whether we accept it. And if we do that, if we do face and accept it, then it's likely that we will experience growth and perhaps even transformation. Thank you. I'll finish there. And we do have
We have a couple of minutes in case somebody wants to ask a question or a final comment on. Sometimes we share a word. Cora runs our Canterbury Conscious Cafe group. Cora, do you want to say something?
Oh, hi, Steve. Yes, it's been great hearing you talk. And a thought came to my mind about this topic is a number of people go on long silent retreats. And I'm just wondering whether these can be a way of awakening, and what is it that actually happens, like these 10-day Vipassana retreats? Have you talked to people who've had spiritual awakening as a result of those?
I have. Yeah, there are definitely some cases I've investigated. The only problem with those is that sometimes it's temporary. It tends to fade away once they return to normal life. It doesn't always hold as well as other transformational experiences. Transformations through turmoil tends to hold, even if there's a slight de-intensification. But yeah, I mean, I think any kind of retreat where the ego mind falls silent, and then it allows the same latent spiritual self or spiritually awakened identity to express itself. But I guess the difficulty is whether it sustains, when a person returns to the hustle and bustle of everyday life.
I was thinking, we don't want to go and put ourselves into a state of,
No.
some sort of horrible trauma or accident. And for people who are searching for this, actually, you have written about that in your book, The Spiritual Awakenings, about the steps to it.
Yeah, I've written about what we can learn from these experiences.
Yeah.
And what they tell us about. I mean, obviously, we don't want to inflict suffering on ourselves. So, although many mystics did in history, they had a whole method of transformation through suffering, through inflicting, terrible ascetic disciplines on themselves and punishments, like wearing hair shirts and that kind of thing. I think that was what they were trying to aim for, really. They're trying to aim for transformation through suffering. But no, we don't want to do that. It's obviously completely counterproductive. But yeah, I think we can learn from the people who have these experiences, and acceptance is one of the things we can learn.
Yeah.
So we have a final hand from Diane. Thank you, Cora.
Yeah. Okay. One of the last things that we were talking about was that, for example, people go through their teenage years. That could very easily be one of the wobbly times when you kind of don't know who you are, and you go through some kind of traumatic depression or some kind of stuff. And but therefore, there are many times during life when you go through something that is going to throw you off course, if you like, and make you feel not stable and able to perform in the way that we agreed in our talk, that having to keep up with the Joneses, having to appear like everybody else, or having to win, or not so much in the group, we've said it in the thing, But it would be really nice to know that there was some kind of either education or some people who were able to guide you or look after you, who you could fall back on, some kind of training or some safety net that could be available if you were going through that moment. Seeing as most of us will go through it for one reason
Yeah,
or another,
yeah.
it'd be really nice if there was something within our society that recognised it.
Mm,
The conversation was that Indigenous groups actually do have this kind of background.
yeah,
They do.
yeah.
They either put themselves in those states deliberately or they understand that people go through it and they'll have a support system. We need a support system.
Yeah, yeah, you're
It's the
completely
quest,
right.
don't we? Yeah.
Mm, I completely agree. There is a bit of support. There is a friend of mine runs the Spiritual Crisis Network, which some of you may have heard of, and they do really good work in supporting people who are having very difficult spiritual awakenings, which are sometimes diagnosed as psychosis. They really help people to ground themselves and process these experiences. But it would be really wonderful if this kind of therapy was available,
Yeah.
to
And it
everybody.
wasn't seen as you're psychotic, you've got something really wrong with you.
Yeah,
You're going through a normal human being type experience and we understand and we can guide you through to the
yeah, and
other
it, it,
side.
it will lead to growth. That is potentially a positive experience. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Every mental health organization should have those kind of therapies available.
Yeah, I'm
Exactly.
sure it will come. There's William Bloom heads up that spiritual companions training,
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
and that is training to do this kind of thing. But you're right, Diane, we need to
Yeah.
involve more in society. Thank you, Diane. We've really come to the end of our session now, and I'm going to bring Judy on in a session. I've put your website, Steve, in the chat, and where we can repeat it.
oh
And
great.
if people are interested in your books and what you do and any talks you do, that's the place to go, is it?
Yeah, that's the best place. Yeah, my website. I have a monthly newsletter, so people can sign up for my newsletter.
Lovely. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks
Um,
everybody for your comments and
it's interesting, in having this discussion, bringing a language to things, as you said right at the beginning, we can have common experiences, but it's difficult to bring the language to it or find the words to express what really would be great if it was common parlance, we'd have more confidence in that. So your work's fantastic.